Good evening, everybody. We're so glad you were able to make it to our third installment of Renegade Rabbis with Professor Howard Lupovitch, who of course is not only beloved member of Beth Ahm, he also is the director of the Cohn-Haddow Center for Judaic Studies at my alma mater, Wayne State University. And tonight he's going to talk about Rabbi Meir Kahane and associated other renegade rabbis. And this promises to be a super exciting evening. And Howie, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Let's do, can everybody see me? Give me a little wave, nod, whatever. Can everybody hear me? How's the volume? Good, you can all hear. That's great. That's good. It's good to see everyone. Hope everyone is being safe and healthy. I have to admit, I am getting used to this Zoom thing. It's, as much as I would love to see you all in person, it was a long day. I don't mind sitting in my house, but having said that, I can't wait to get back to seeing you all in person. So let's not make too much of that. So welcome everyone. This evening, in our third of our fourth session, I would say that our topic for this evening is the most controversial of the four. In fact, I know that, or at least I'm saying that because prior to the series even starting, there were people who wrote to me who were disturbed by the fact that I was including Meir Kahane in a series with the three others in this series. Kahane is, or was, well, still is, an enormously controversial figure. He has diehard followers, but he also has elicited real outrage and anger from his detractors. He was maybe one of the singularly most controversial Jewish figures certainly of the late 20th century. And well, I guess the best way to start is like I did last week. Since I imagine many of you, I just heard Alex saying, I imagine many of you have heard him speak at some point. So let me start this evening by reflecting on, I heard him speak twice. I heard him speak twice in person, and I also saw him, on radio, on television, whatever. But so let me talk about those two times, sort of introduce this evening. The first was probably in the mid 80s. In Ann Arbor. He came to Ann Arbor to speak, and it was very telling at the time that there was not a single organization on campus, Jewish or otherwise, that would sponsor his talk, except for one, Chabad. So he was sponsored by the local Chabad house, and it was difficult to even find a venue for him. They wouldn't let him speak at the Michigan Union. They wouldn't let him speak anywhere. So he wound up speaking at the Women's League, which is a nice place, but it was a little bit out of the way. But, I was about 20 years old at the time, and this was my impression. I had heard of him. First of all, if you've heard him, whether you agree with him or not, whether you love him or hate him, there's no denying he was an electrifying speaker. The man knew how to speak from the podium. And in this particular evening, at 20 years old, I found myself agreeing with all of his questions. I found myself saying to myself, all the questions he's asking, I asked the same question. But his answers, I found absolutely unacceptable. And I think that's a key to understanding Kahane. However you feel about him is as objectionable as you might find him, or as beloved as you might find him. The important thing to understanding is he raised some very important questions. What made him controversial and what makes him part of this series of renegades are the questions he asks, questions he posed, the challenges he put forward to the Jewish establishment in particular, both in the United States and in the state of Israel. But also the way that his questions and challenges resonated among other people as well. And with that, let me tell you about the second time. The second time I saw him speak was in Israel, a very different crowd. First, I would say that sitting next to me in Israel was my first up-close encounter with someone from the JDL, the Jewish Defense League. But this was this was a JDLnik who had made Aliyah and was part of the settler movement. And we were having a little conversation, and you can sort of picture what he looked like. I'll give a sort of a snapshot description. He was wearing a white shirt, untucked, with black polyester pants, little bit on the heavy side, kind of a scruffy beard, big smile on his face. And in our conversation, he was saying things like the best way to solve a problem was with a knife and a gun, which I really had never heard anyone say that before, at least maybe someone not in the context of war, a soldier or law enforcement or something. It was eye-opening. But there was a moment where he was speaking, and the crowd was full of Jews who were North African and who had a particular relationship with Arabs, both in Israel and in the lands where they came from. And this was the moment where Kahane really hooked them. I'm going to say it to you in Hebrew, and then I'm going to translate it for you. Okay? He's at the podium, speaking in that, real intense sort of way, very animated, and he says, quote, "Ha'aravim hem jukim, va'anachnu yodim ma osim im jukim," which means Arabs are cockroaches, and we all know what you do with cockroaches. And he started to stomp on the podium or on the floor as hard as he could. And it really riveted the crowd. Now, I mention these stories just to say that, yes, he had serious detractors, but he also was a way to cultivate the following. But I also wanted to mention that, just to set him in the context of this series, is that so far in this series, we've seen two individuals, the Baal Shem Tov and Sherwin.
Uh-oh. We're gifted. Beth Ahm is absolutely gifted.
You're frozen.
Howie, can you hear us? Maybe not.
Uh-oh,
I think he lost his internet connectivity.
This is like service.
Frozen in time.
We should call him.
Unmute. Here, something's happening.
They're doing something. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, we should
Are we
mute
back?
ourselves, yeah.
Huh? Help.
Oh,
I just called Howie. He's going to try and reconnect.
he's the only one with problems.
Hopefully not a power failure. I know we've all been having those this summer, or at least I have.
Thanks. I to restart my iPad.
Zwei, das zwei. Bob Kleinberg, Rob Kleinberg is here.
Yeah, we're not muted, so. Okay.
Where is he? We are muted.
No, you're not.
No, you're not.
Oh.
I'm sorry, everybody, about the technical difficulties.
Kahane doesn't like what Howie is going to say about him. The spirit is out there.
Please stand by.
Somebody needs to go and shake the rabbit ears and the hanger.
Right. No, but there used to
some
be
aluminum foil. Everybody's
TV
eating. I want to know if they can share.
Share what?
A lot of people are eating. I have no food.
If you had told me, Susan, I would have made you a sandwich and delivered it to you.
Mickey, we can see your hair, but we can't see your face.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that.
There we go.
What were we talking about?
What were we talking about?
In any case, with
He was
Kahane,
stamping his feet.
yes, he was stamping his feet. The point I'm making is Kahane had devoted followers. He had serious detractors. And in the context of our series, it's more difficult to see with respect to Kahane the positive contribution that he made. Whereas with other things, with Sherwin and the Baal Shem Tov, and as we'll see next week, we have individuals who started with radical ideas but eventually incorporated in. You know, this really illustrates the fact that when we talk about someone with renegade radical ideas that become mainstreamed in Jewish thinking, that is for better or for worse. And, you know, without giving too much away, with what Kahane, a big part of his emphasis is going to be, as we shall see, on fear and outrage. But I'm jumping ahead. I just wanted to give you a sense of the electrifying nature of what he had to say. So let's talk about who he was and the ideas that actually shaped him, okay? He was born in New York. His father was a rabbi. His parents were immigrants from Europe. He lost a lot of family in the Holocaust. That's very much, you know, part of that generation. He was born in the late 1930s. He graduated from Brooklyn College. He also graduated from law school and got a master's in public policy. He was an educated person. He was ordained a rabbi at the Meir Yeshiva in New York. So he had that dual rabbinic and academic background. He was a well-educated individual. Now, early in his life, one of the formative moments for him is in the early 1950s. His father, who was a congregation rabbi in Brooklyn, the synagogue was graffitied with anti-Semitic graffiti, swastikas and things like that. And Kahane recalls his father saying, and he was a young man at the time, he was 14 years old at the time, and he remembers his father saying, maybe we Jews should form our own underground. He was alluding to the Jewish underground that had existed in the pre-State of Israel days, the days before 1948, which had fought the British. And, you know, looking back, his father later said that he really wasn't being that serious, but he wasn't Meir Kahane yet. When he was young, he was Martin Kahane. The young Martin Kahane took that very seriously. And it was from that young age that he began to think about the most effective, or maybe the only effective way for Jews to respond to anti-Semitism, and the path that he was going to go down, and really the challenge he was going to make to the American Jewish establishment more than anything else is, what is the most effective way to respond to anti-Semitism? And in his mind, a group like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, their strategies and methods and tactics were at best incomplete, at worst entirely impotent and useless. Kahane was a believer that it was necessary for Jews to truly protect themselves, that they needed to be able to fight. It wasn't enough to use words to work within the system like the ADL did and still does. He didn't see much effectiveness in that. In his mind, it's something more radical and drastic was required. Now, he had this view from a young age. In some ways, this view was cemented by three things. First of all, the fact that he lived in the immediate post-Holocaust generation was a defining part. It was just a formative part of his personality, not only in terms of responding to anti-Semitism, but also issues of the future of the Jewish people, the survival of the Jewish people. He had the mentality from the time he was a young man all the way until he died in 1990, that Jews, whether in Israel or America or anywhere in the world, were living on a precipice, and that since it was possible for the Holocaust to happen once, then it would also be possible for it to happen again, and it could happen regardless of where Jews were. And here I would underline the fact how much this was against the grain in the second half of the 20th century. Now, historically, there was this long-standing notion of Jewish vulnerability in the diaspora, which in many ways, the Holocaust had really galvanized that notion of Jewish powerlessness. However, it's important to keep in mind that certainly by the time we get to the 1960s and beyond, Kahane is articulating these ideas at a time when, as far as Jewish politics and Jewish power are concerned, the world Jewry is in a situation we can only call it the embarrassment of riches in terms of real political power. Because remember, during the second half of the 19th century, for the first time in centuries, A, there was a sovereign Jewish state, but also B, American Jews, really from the 1960s on, began to experience, well, began to gain a level of political influence and real political power in the United States that was almost unprecedented in the diaspora. But for Kahane, that was all an illusion. The reality, he believed, that was being artificially masked by the existence of the state of Israel and the success of American Jews was the ever-present looming possibility of another Holocaust. In fact, I remember visiting in the state of Israel in the early 1980s. I was on a tour. I was on USY Israel pilgrimage, and one of the places they took us was a small little museum in Jerusalem, which had been sponsored by which had really been put together, curated by the JDL, and it was called the Museum of the Potential Holocaust. And in this museum, basically, it was designed for young American Jews coming to Israel to show them that when you go back, don't feel too comfortable in America because you are on the cusp of some major catastrophe. That was in the early 1980s. But that was one part. I think in many ways that was the core part, the never again mentality of Kahane. That was an important formative part of his whole way of seeing the world and seeing the role of the Jews in it. Now, that particular mentality was refined by his other two influences. There were two Zionist thinkers who influenced him more than any other. One was Rav Kook, and the other was Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky. Let me say a word about each one of these, and then we can see how they influenced him. And I'll say right from the start that he was influenced by both of these, but to understand that influence, you have to take their ideas and you have to filter them through the trauma of the post-Holocaust world. In other words, the way he used the ideas of Rav Kook and Jabotinsky were not, I wouldn't call it an unfiltered or direct connection. It was mediated by this ever-looming fear of some sort of catastrophe. Now, they're both complicated individuals, Rav Kook and Jabotinsky. I could and have given a whole talk about either one of them. Let me say briefly about each one. Rav Kook was an early proponent of Mizrahi Zionism, religious Zionism. Unlike many Orthodox and Haredi and Hasidic rabbis who thought that Zionism was some form of heresy and was violating the commandment to wait for the Messiah, Rav Kook was among a minority of religious Jews who believed the contrary, that Zionism was the first step towards messianic redemption. And more importantly, Rav Kook believed that even though Zionism itself was a secular movement, building a secular state, it was nonetheless religious in nature, and nonetheless they were carrying out the will of God. But let's hear it in his words. Tova, I think you have to enable me to be the host again.
1 second.
Okay.
I have to find you on the
Okay.
list of people. Or do you want, I can just share it.
Let's try me doing it.
Okay.
Rav Kook was he was the unofficial chief rabbi of the Yishuv. He was beloved to everyone. So this is the contrast I want to make. The ideas that Rav Kook are going to suggest, he made them with the aim of all Jews getting along. Kahane is going to use them in a very, very different way. Okay. Did you find me? All right.
Yes, you should now be the co-host.
Okay. Wonderful. All right. Lovely. Okay. So if you look at the second and third text, we'll come back to the first one in a minute. These are two excerpts from Rav Kook. He's writing toward the beginning of the 20th century. And the point he's going to make here is that secular Zionists don't realize they're performing religious acts. So let me read the first one here. Quote, this is from Chazon HaGeula, the Vision of Redemption. The bricks, meaning the bricks of building the state of Israel, can also be borne by those who do not divine the religious meaning of the work. They can even supervise the work. When the time comes, however, the hidden meaning will be revealed. There are people who do not have the slightest idea what an important role they play in the scheme of divine providence. They are called out, but do not know who is calling them. And the next one as well, from Orat Yisrael, Lights of Israel. The difference between the soul of Israel, its essence and aspirations, and that of the soul of the Gentiles of all ranks is greater and deeper than the difference between the human soul and the soul of the beast, inasmuch as in the latter, the difference is a matter of quantity, while between the former is a difference of quality. Now, what Rav Kook is saying in the second one, he's saying that yes, Jews are chosen, Jews are distinct. In the first one, he's saying that Zionism, that everything Zionists do is a reflection of the will of God. It is sacred, even though its aims are secular, okay? Now, from this, what Kahane gleaned from this is that by the time we get to Kahane, several generations later, he understood Rav Kook to mean that the secular aspects of the state were somehow lesser than the religious aspects of the state. He understood Rav Kook to be saying the state should be a state based on Judaism, Jewish law. In other words, the state of Israel should be a halachic state, run based on the theological ideas of Judaism, something we will come back to. Okay, now what about Jabotinsky? Jabotinsky was the founder of right-wing Zionism, the revisionist Zionist movement in the 1920s. He is best known for, I would say from the get-go that Jabotinsky is someone who has been highly misunderstood both by his supporters and by his detractors. For example, yes, Jabotinsky was a believer. His main core belief about Zionism is that the Jewish state that was being built had to have a Jewish majority. But, and here's the surprising part, let's look at what Jabotinsky writes in the next text. What do revisionist Zionists want? He writes, quote, "We define our position on the Arab question as clear recognition of an objective fact. Even after the creation of a Jewish majority, a large Arab community will remain in the country." In other words, Jabotinsky believed that as long as there's a Jewish majority, the Arab minority is going to be part of this state. And if hard times beset even part of this population, the whole country will bear the yoke of its suffering. You can't differentiate between Arab suffering, persecution of Arabs, whatever their situation, from the whole population. In Jabotinsky's opinion, they were fully to be part of state and society in the state that was going to be created. Sound political, economic, and social conditions for Arabs will forever remain, therefore, a central factor for the vitality and health of Israel as a whole. And here's the key sentence: complete civic equality of the two races, meaning Jews and Arabs, the two languages, and all religions will in the future predominate in the Jewish state. The Arabs who live in the Jewish state must be full and equal citizens. Now, that's Jabotinsky talking. That's not me talking, and that's not someone who's left-wing talking. That is the founder of the Israeli right talking. Now, Kahane, he gleaned some of that. He definitely liked the idea of the Jewish majority, but where he went with it, in his mind, he didn't realize, or he didn't choose to recognize, that Jabotinsky was not talking about the creation of a Jewish majority as a means to an end, but as an end in and of itself. In other words, the reason Jabotinsky was advocating for a Jewish majority in the Jewish state is only if there's a Jewish majority can the state be both Jewish and democratic. This is something we hear debated all the time now. For Jabotinsky, the Jewish majority was a means to an end, a state which is both Jewish and democratic. For Kahane, the Jewish majority was an end in and of itself, and the presence of the Arabs in the Jewish state is secondary and a matter of almost indifference. In Kahane's worldview, the Arabs really had no role there. They didn't need to be there. Kahane one of the more radical things he said when he moved to Israel, formed a new party in the 70s, and then became part of the Knesset in the 80s, he started advocating for the expulsion of the Arabs, the relocation of the Arabs. Now, he was saying it in the name of Jabotinsky, but this is not something Jabotinsky said. But to the day he died, he was a devoted follower of Jabotinsky, and he believed he was acting as Jabotinsky's heir. In fact, when he was younger, the youth movement that Kahane belonged to was Beitar, which was the youth movement of the revisionist Zionist movement. It was founded by Begin. He saw himself in the spirit of Jabotinsky and Begin. Begin and Jabotinsky did not, well, Jabotinsky would not have agreed. Begin did not agree. Begin was the one who, at the end of the 1980s, or Begin was instrumental in setting in motion that what eventually happened in the end of the 1980s, in 1988, Kahane and his party were expelled from the Knesset for their views. So, you know, he had these right-wing views, which were so right-wing that even Israelis in the 80s who were all the way on the right didn't like them. I have to give you an example here. If you look at the very, very first text. This is a quote from Yitzhak Shamir. Now, Yitzhak Shamir was the prime minister of Israel in the early 80s. Prior to Bibi, he was the most right-wing prime minister that Israel ever had. He was, as part of his Zionist upbringing, he wasn't part of Jabotinsky or Begin's Irgun. He was part of the fringe group that broke away, the Lehi party, the Stern gang. And this is very far to the right. And this is what he said about Kahane in 1998. This is a quote. Kahane, a terrorist, as one who was long involved in terror, let me tell you, he was a second-rate terrorist, all bluster, symbolism, and rhetoric with almost no real action. He had no concept of underground militarism and camaraderie. The first rule of an underground movement is that comrades protect each other. When one of his gang would get into trouble in the USA, he would send them to Israel and throw him to the dogs, never once checking up on how he was faring. Kahane didn't understand what the word military meant. He had no honor. Now, that was not some left-wing critic. That wasn't Ben Gurion. That wasn't even Begin. That was Yitzhak Shamir. So Kahane was really cutting against the grain, and part of the reason he would elicit that kind of criticism is he was claiming to act as the fulfillment of the views of Rav Kook and Jabotinsky, when in fact, what he was advocating was something that neither had advocated. But the important thing is as someone living in Israel, he believed that the state should be religious in nature. He also believed that it wasn't just that conflict was inevitable. Conflict was imminent, and this is where he really broke ranks, not only with, let's say, the Haganah, but even with Begin, is he believed that violence was an acceptable solution. Now, he wasn't the only one who engaged in violence. Of course not. The Israeli army, it's an army. Obviously, there's violence. Their motto was defense. The Irgun was willing to be somewhat more proactive, but none as just willing to engage in violence as Kahane himself. And this view paralleled his view in the United States with respect to American Jewry, this notion that American Jewry is on the edge of destruction, and the only way to prevent that destruction is to fight. And by fighting, he meant actively and violently. Actively and armed. Now, in the United States, in the 60s, he got his first, before he became embroiled in Israeli politics, until 1971, he was involved in really politics in the city of New York. And really, for him, the moment came in the late 1960s. One of the formative moments was the events that happened in Brownsville, New York in 1968. Now, Brownsville was a neighborhood that was changing. It had been a Jewish neighborhood, but by the 60s, it was largely an African-American neighborhood. But most of the teachers in the public schools, or many of them, were Jewish, and the majority were still white. But most of the students by this point were African-American, and there were tensions there, particularly in 1968, when the Brownsville Teachers Union went on strike. Now, when they went on strike, they were striking for the usual things that school teachers strike for: wages, working conditions, benefits, the usual thing. But it brought up a kind of tension, maybe a combination of class tension and racial tension in Brownsville, because students and parents and people, the African-American community in Brownsville, they felt that the teachers, by going on strike, were only thinking about their own well-being and were basically ignoring the well-being of the students. And since most of the teachers were middle class and most of the students were poor, there was real tension there. And there were instances where Jewish teachers in Brownsville were being hassled on the way to and from school, while going on strike, even after the strike was resolved. Kahane got involved. He saw that moment as a very telling moment for American Jews. Now, he was aware that for decades preceding Brownsville in 1968, there had been this working relationship between the Jewish community and the Black community. Civil rights, for example, or earlier on, the founding of the NAACP. There had been this kind of camaraderie, and most American Jews, Kahane correctly concluded, assumed or presumed that that relationship would continue, but that very relationship was being strained at the end of the 1960s, in part due to a changing mentality within the civil rights movement. During the early civil rights movement, really until 1967 or 1968, there was a sort of welcoming of Jewish assistance. You know, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Jacob Prinz, those rabbis who participated in the marches, and all the young Jewish people who participated in the freedom marches. There was a sort of a gratitude, a partnership. But by the end of the 1960s, there were voices within the civil rights movement, African-American voices, who began to say, we need to do this without the help of white people. And by white people, they included Jewish people. So that's where this tension was coming from. And conditions for Jews, not only these Jewish school teachers, but conditions where Jews were beginning to deteriorate. And Kahane was a response to this. Let's look at a couple of examples of this. Look at the second text from the bottom on the first page, or the fifth text altogether. This was a television interview he gave in 1969. By the way, I put the link there. When we're done, you can go watch this on YouTube. Quote, this is Kahane talking in 1969. I believe there is an obligation on our part to those poor Jews, to those oppressed Jews, to go and help them in whatever manner is necessary. In other words, he felt that the leaders of the Jewish community, groups like the ADL, were not helping enough. The board of rabbis, no one was helping Jews who were being hassled. Okay, let's go on. We've got the boys, and we've got the honor and the pride. We have, in effect, got the mystique, which tells the anti-Semite that if he wants to start with me or with other people in the JDL, an organization he had recently founded, the Jewish Defense League, he's really starting up with the wrong Jew. And here, listen to this. To turn the other cheek is, of course, in the Bible, but you've been reading the wrong Bible. He's saying this to what is largely a non-Jewish television audience, or at least many of them are not Jewish. Jewish sources have a very definite place in the use of force. Violence is also always bad, but many times necessary, and therefore I believe has a place. Is he right there? Sort of. You know, the thing about the Jewish attitude towards violence, both in antiquity and in the Middle Ages, is yes, there's a recognition that violence is sometimes necessary. But I would also say that if you really want to understand the Jewish notion of the use of violent force, the person who really captured it, and he wasn't talking about anything specifically Jewish, was the author Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov, in one of his science fiction books called The Foundation Trilogy, he puts this line in the mouth of one of his characters, someone who is reluctant to use violence, a leader who is reluctant to use violence. And the quote is, and this is Asimov, "Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent." Now, he wasn't saying you're incompetent if you wind up resorting to some sort of violent response. What Asimov was saying, and what this character in the novel was saying, that if you need to resort to violence somewhere along the line, you have made a mistake. Problems are resolvable without violence if you proceed properly. That's the basic notion. And Judaism goes to great lengths to discourage the use of violence, and certainly to discourage the use of violence in a casual or first response. Kahane did not agree. And this was part of the mentality of him founding the JDL in 1968. The Jewish Defense League was to be an alternative, let's call it a more activist, and a more activist alternative to the ADL, which was willing to use violence, as opposed to, he believed the way the ADL and other Jewish organizations worked through the system to respond to anti-Semitism was basically ineffective. And he believed this was a better way to do it. So look at the bottom of the first page. Let's read the Pledge of Allegiance of the JDL, which captures Kahane's worldview very, very well. Okay, quote, "With love of my people and pride in my heritage, I hereby affirm my readiness to sacrifice my time, my energy, and my very being for their defense. I affirm my total allegiance to the instrument of that defense, the Jewish Defense League. I affirm my allegiance to the group, to my brothers and sisters, and to my commanders. I accept total discipline to their commands and with faith in their judgment, their aims, and their ability. I pledge my people to be faithful to their survival, never again." Now, that's some pretty potent stuff. I think you'll agree. What's interesting is that the influence there, or even the language there, Kahane borrowed from a group that he had tremendous respect for, but didn't really care for, and this group was the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were a radical part of the civil rights movement that was advocating violence in protection of oppressed Black people. And look at the next one. And this is from another television interview. This is from 1970. Listen to what he says here. He says, "We, the JDL, believe, after 6 million dead Jews, that before you can have love, you must have respect. And one does not get respect unless one has self-respect. And that means that just as other ethnic groups say, this or that is beautiful, well, that's beautiful. Black is beautiful for Blacks, that's great. Well, Jewish is beautiful and primary for Jews." He had this notion that the only way to gain respect for Jews is to fight. And that put him at odds with not only the Jewish establishment, but with most Jews. But where he found a following in the 1960s and 70s was, first of all, among Jews who had experienced some sort of violence, some sort of violent anti-Semitism. But there also were instances where he took this radical point of view and was actually able to energize the American Jewish community in a way that no one else was. And this is with regard to one specific issue, and this was with respect to the plight of Soviet Jews. Now, long story short, by the end of the 1960s, it was clear, it was probably becoming known to American Jews, thanks in part to the writings of Elie Wiesel, who called Soviet Jews the Jews of silence, unable to express themselves. But it was becoming clear that there were many Jews in the Soviet Union who either wanted to leave or be more openly Jewish, who were not able. They were being persecuted in certain ways. And Kahane was an important instrument in rallying American Jews, even beyond his own specific following, in the cause of Soviet Jewry. When he died in 1990, most of the obituaries, I think just about every obituary of Kahane in 1990 mentioned that, credited him with setting in motion the Soviet Jewry movement in the United States. But in some ways, I think this might be the place where this zealotry actually worked for the positive. Beyond that, and this was part of the problem, Kahane had a pretty sophisticated view of the world, and also a pretty sophisticated view of the use of violence and what the JDL was for. The problem is that many of the young Jews in particular who joined the JDL, they didn't have Kahane's sophisticated and nuanced view of the world. For them, it was just a chance to get together and beat people up. You know, like that guy I mentioned sitting next to at the Kahane lecture. And that is a problem. That is a problem, is that if everyone in the JDL had been Kahane, if he could have cloned himself a few hundred times, that would have been one thing. But there were many members of the JDL who were, perhaps they were there for the wrong reason. You know, there was an interesting, there was an interview done where someone was studying members of the JDL, and I would say at least a few of them were there out of, I don't know how to say it, out of a sense of vengeance for what happened to them in high school or something like that. But they didn't have Kahane's sophistication. And I think that's very telling about the rank and file members of the JDL. But it's also something very telling about Kahane himself. There was real potential in him to be a real leader within the Jewish community. If he could have moderated his rhetoric even a little, he might have fit in better and he might even have led more effectively. Simple fact is he couldn't or wouldn't. And what it really came down to is he was really never able to unglue himself from the proposition of never again, or at least to see beyond it. It was always important. He was right there. But it remained, if not the totality, the majority of his worldview was dominated by that. But, you know, even in his relationship with African Americans, in some ways, you know, he recognized certain things. Look at the next one where it says Kahane 1977. This is something he wrote. He was writing in response to Jews who were saying that talking about the anti-Semitism from the African American community in the late 1970s. This is the moment when we have the emergence of individuals like Minister Louis Farrakhan. And Kahane writes in 1977, and I think very presciently, he writes, "The danger to the Jew in this country does not come from blacks. That's nonsense. It comes from whites. I think the man who complains about blacks moving into his neighborhood is wrong." And he's addressing in a sort of ironic way, I think, why that Jews do not need to be afraid of black people, no matter what had happened in Brownville. By 1977, Kahane is realizing that there's a larger problem of anti-Semitism here. And he's concerned that the clashes or the tensions between Jews and the African-American community in the late 1960s were going to define or preoccupy the concerns of Jews moving forward. Okay, but we can come back to that at the end. Okay, but I think the main idea, and the idea I want to spend the last few minutes on, is the way that Kahane justified this worldview, not only in terms of his understanding of Jabotinsky and Rav Kook, but even more deeply in the way he understood the totality of Jewish tradition. So let's look at a couple of things he wrote about what it means to be Jewish, and especially the relationship of Jews to God. And it gives us a real window into how he saw the world and what made him so insurmountably radical in this way. Okay, look at the text from 1975 called "Listen World, Listen Jew." Okay? And again, the undercurrent here is two things. He is going to justify violence, but he is also going to say that violence is something inherently and naturally in line with Jewish tradition. What he is doing is fulfilling the will of God. Quote, "When the Jew is beaten, God is profaned. When the Jew is humiliated, God is shamed. When the Jew is attacked, it is an assault upon the name of God. Every pogrom is the desecration of the name. Every Auschwitz and expulsion and murder and rape of a Jew is the humiliation of God. Every time a Jew is beaten by a Gentile because he is a Jew, this is the essence of Chilul Hashem, desecration of the name of God." Okay? I don't think anyone would disagree with that. That's what I mean by you agree with his questions. This is his diagnosis of a problem. He goes on. A Jewish fist in the face of an astonished Gentile world that had not seen it for 2 millennia, that is Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying the name of God. You see what he's doing? If Jews being picked on is the desecration, then Jews punching back is the only way to sanctify the name of God. Jewish dominion over the Christian holy places, while the church that sucked our blood vomits its rage and frustration. That is Kiddush Hashem. There he's talking about in Jerusalem. A Jewish air force that is better than any other, and that forces a Lebanese airliner down so we can prison murderers of Jews rather than having to repeat the centuries of old pattern of begging the Gentiles to do it for us. This is Kiddush Hashem. Armed, active, violent. That's the way you sanctify the name of God. Look at the next one. Here's his understanding of the holiday of Pesach from his commentary on the Haggadah. Incidentally, if you're looking for an interesting commentary for the Haggadah for your Seder, I would not recommend using this one. This is tame compared to what else is in there. I mean, I don't know the kind of conversation you want to have, but, if you do, caveat, please note the caveat. Disclaimer noted. Okay. Quote, Pesach is a holiday that was created to commemorate the sanctity of vengeance, the punishment and the destruction of Pharaoh and Egypt that mocked and humiliated God by crying, "Who is the Lord? I know not the Lord." Vengeance so that the world shall know the Lord and cry, "Verily there is a God that judges the earth." For it is only vengeance that proves that there is indeed a God in the world, that there is good and evil and punishment for that evil. Now, when you read this, you can hear generations of Jewish scholars and interpreters shaking their heads. And I mean mainstream scholars like Rabbi Akiva, like Hillel, like Maimonides, Nachmanides going, no, that's really not how those verses are to be understood. Kahane had a particular understanding here. Look at the next one. In a short book he wrote called Chilul Hashem, Desecration of the Name of God. God created the state not for the Jew and not as a reward for his justice and good deeds. It is because he, blessed be he, decided that he can no longer take the desecration of his name and the laughter, disgrace, and persecution of the people that was named for him. So he ordered the state of Israel into existence, which is a total contradiction to the diaspora. If the diaspora, with its humiliations, defeats, persecutions, second-class status of minority, means Chilul Hashem, then a sovereign Jewish state which provides the Jew home, majority status, land of his own, a military of his own, and a victory over the defeated Gentile on the battlefield is the exact opposite Kiddush Hashem. It is the reassertion, the proof, the testimony for the existence of God and his government. There is no other Zionist thinker that says this, including Jabotinsky. What Kahane is essentially doing is trying to, let's say, resurrect. There was an idea briefly in early Zionism called Shlilat HaGalut, Zionism as the negation of the diaspora, which most Zionist thinkers basically abandoned very early on. And Kahane is bringing this back, but he's bringing it back not in a secular political sense. He's bringing it back in a theological sense. The state of Israel was created for Jews to be proper Jews, but also to dominate, to have dominion over non-Jews. Now, many of his ideas really were collected in a book that was published called The Jewish Idea in 1993, well, originally in Hebrew, Or HaRa'ayon, and The Jewish Idea. And really, if you're going to read one Kahane book, this I think is the one you should take a look at. It encapsulates the best, or at least the most engaging, and well, the least angry of all of it. Let's read a couple of excerpts from this book. This is the one right after Chilul Hashem. Quote, when God takes the revenge of his people and of himself, he thereby sanctifies his name, proving to the world that Israel indeed has a God and that he lives and endures. The victory of injustice and wickedness is ostensible proof of God's absence from the world, and there's no greater profanation of God's name. By contrast, God's victory and revenge over his enemies, the evildoers, prove to the world that verily there is a God who judges on earth, quoting the Psalms. It is only through revenge that God is revived and awakened. Now, it's true. There are points where the prophets in the Bible, for example, speak about God taking vengeance. But those sentiments are overwhelmed by notions of mercy, by notions of compassion, and by notions of, above all, Jews, once being liberated from the diaspora, becoming or lagoyim, a light unto the exile. Jews are supposed to be the great exemplar of morality and ethics, which is a notion which is prevalent throughout Jewish tradition and almost entirely absent from Kahane. At no point, or it's very hard to find, where Kahane speaks about the ethical tradition of Judaism as it is applied to anyone but other Jews. And here I'd be even more specific, because he had a problem with Jews who weren't religiously observant. He believed they were all assimilated, and it's not clear that he included them as the rightful recipients of this ethical treatment. They were almost beyond the pale, okay? Look at the next one. The people of Israel are a unique and chosen people. Israel is the Holy One, blessed be He's messenger in the world, the one who was commanded to constitute the reason for creation. That is why the Holy One, blessed be He, blessed and elevated Israel to the level of superior nation, which exceeds all the rest of humanity with its spirit and pure soul. So he's using the notion of in this case, a Jewish state as an exemplar, but he's juxtaposing with what he expects that Jewish state to do, okay? One more. This one is also from 1993. Okay, and here this really I think gets to the point, and really this is where he really diverges from Jabotinsky's notion of the state being both Jewish and democratic. Nonsense and vanity are those foreign values which infiltrated into large sectors of God's people, advocating the equality of all men and nations. Basically, he's saying the notion of universal equality or the equality of all people is some Gentile foreign nonsense that had no business becoming part of a Jewish way of thinking. But wait, this equality, which is so important for the Gentiles, has no place in the temple of truth of the qualities and values of God's Torah. God created himself a special, unique, holy, superior people, the people of Israel, which will live in isolation. And sorry are the eyes and ears that hear and see the large portions of God's people that have assimilated and distorted the truth so deeply that many of them kick their crown, abandon the land, and dispute the concept of their election as a holy and superior people as sons of God. In other words, the notion that the Jewish state should be democratic, not only does Kahane see that as not necessary, he sees it as unnatural. In his mind, the Jewish state is to return to being a theocracy, a state where Jews, they can regain their special status, but no one else has any real status at all, okay? The next excerpt illustrates this point as well. This is a Jewish state. It bows in front of Judaism and does not contradict it. It acts in accordance with Jewish values and Jewish commandments, even if these contradict international law and diplomacy. Even if they contrast the normal and accepted Western and democratic lifestyle, this is so even if this puts its interest under risk and threatens to isolate it from the civilized people. The duty of Judaism is to be separate, unique, different, and chosen. This is the role of the Jewish people and their instrument, the state of Israel. We have no part in the standard values of the nations. Assimilation does not begin with mixed marriages, but in copying and adapting foreign values, alien and non-Jewish concepts and ideas. So in other words, he says two things here. First of all, he says all of these Western values, for example, democracy, civil rights, any of that, has nothing to do with the state of Israel. It's not why the state of Israel was founded, he argued. And moreover, at the end, what he adds here is intermarriage. He's talking to American Jews who are lamenting the problem of high intermarriage rates. And he said, that's just a symptom. The big problem is assimilation. You've abandoned the true nature of Judaism. The true nature of Judaism is not to be led or influenced, or in his mind, misled or misinfluenced by these non-Jewish ideas. And that's what put him at odds with not only most American Jews, but also, and not only Jews in Israel who were left-wing, who were socialist, who were secular. Most Jews in Israel across the spectrum believe in Jabotinsky's notion of the state being a democratic state. They believe in the mission of the state of Israel. And most Jews around the world believe in the mission of Israel to be an exemplar of morality. And Kahane has completely jettisoned those. But we know why. Because his combination of Rav Kook and Jabotinsky and the trauma of the Holocaust in his mind, this is his way, is the only way which Jews are going to survive. Now let me wind up by saying a few words about his legacy, about Kahane's legacy. First of all, in the 80s, he founded a party called Kach. Now, Kach is the Hebrew word for thus. And Kach is basically a political party, a fringe right-wing political party that embodied all of his ideas. Now, it was founded in the 80s. I'm sorry, it really was founded in the late 70s. During the 80s, when left and right in Israel, post-Begin, were evenly matched, this is the point in Israeli politics where fringe parties began to have a disproportionate amount of influence and leverage. And that's how Kach became part of a ruling coalition. And for 4 years, Kahane and his party were part of the deliberations of the Knesset. They were woven into the fabric. As I said, in 1988, they were done. The rest of Israeli society just couldn't deal with this. But with Kach and the Knesset, they were especially loud voice with respect to the question of what are we going to do with the Palestinians. For Kahane, it was easy. Negotiations were a waste of time, and he wasn't interested, will negotiations be successful or not? Can you negotiate a state? His is not a critique of the peace process. In his mind, negotiating in any way, creating any kind of political space or cultural space or any kind of space for the Palestinians in the Jewish state of Israel is not only unnecessary, but it's unnatural. He wanted them removed. He simply wanted them sent someplace else. He believed the entirety of Eretz Yisrael belonged to the Jews. And here's where he deviated from Jabotinsky. He believed it belonged to the Jews and only to the Jews. And in this period of time after Begin, who said something very different, and even Shamir, who said something very different, he was so far out of step, he had to be banned. But where do we find his voice today in Israeli politics? We do find his voice on the far right of Israeli politics. I think the individual who most encapsulates him today is a guy whose name is Bezalel Smotrich. Now, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's in the news from time to time. I put his picture on the front page because before I read what he wrote, you got to get a look at him, because look, what a nice looking guy. Doesn't he look like he's so neatly groomed, someone a mother could love. He looks like such a nice guy. He's generally a soft-spoken individual. And so he seems like he's going to be very nice, but look what he says. He says things like, well, I put 2 quotes here. First is, he has been the outspoken critic of any kind of negotiation with the Palestinians. He sees the Palestinians the way Kahane saw the world, as this existential threat to the very existence of the state of Israel. And he writes in 2015, a government that treats the most moral population in the state of Israel as a terror-supporting population loses its right to exist. Now, he's not talking about Palestinians there. He's one of the leaders of the settler movements, and he's defending the settlers' rights to take Kahane-like action against their Palestinian neighbors or their Palestinian fellow residents of the territories. A government that treats the most moral population, meaning especially religious settlers, as a terror-supporting population, loses its right to exist. When you push an entire community up against the wall, treat its members like terrorists, demonize it, trample on its rights, it ultimately explodes. He's justifying settler violence against Palestinians because, in his mind, the settlers are the only true and rightful inhabitants of any part of Eretz Yisrael. Palestinians have no right to be there. And so settlers trying to defend and remember, this isn't only a political right or historical right. This is a God-given right. Settlers, he believes, are acting in defense of something that has been given to them by God. Okay? Let no one be surprised when this should happen, when more and more people will be pushed against their will to carry out actions that are forbidden. And forbidden here means forbidden by the state. But he's living in a world, but he's basically living in Kahane world. Kahane could have written this very thing 20 years earlier. The other thing, which I think gives away more about Smotrich, is, his antipathy towards Palestinians wasn't only political or theological in nature; it was very personal. When his wife gave birth in a hospital, there was a Palestinian woman giving birth in the next room or the next bed or whatever, and they didn't like it. And look at this quote from 2017. It's only natural my wife would not want to lie next to someone who just gave birth to a baby that might murder her baby in another 20 years. That is one of the crassest ways of saying, he isn't just saying all Palestinians are terrorists, but he's saying this baby is definitely growing up to be someone who's going to become a terrorist. The way we say it is, he is essentializing Palestinians as terrorists. Now, it's hard to see that statement in particular as anything other than racist. Pigeonholing an entire group of people based on the actions of some is difficult. Now, it's also a point that's also a point of debate. But Smotrich in the Israeli context, that's where we see echoes of Kahane. Now, he doesn't pay homage to Kahane that often. In many ways, more often, he does what Kahane does. He is posturing himself as the heir of Jabotinsky and Begin. In reality, he is the heir of Kahane. Now, he has achieved a measure of influence that Kahane never achieved. But in Smotrich, we see a kind of what-if scenario. If Kahane had managed, if he had not been expelled, if he had allowed to continue, well, that's where it would have wound up. Now, the other person I see as an heir to Kahane, and this one is a little murkier, and I will fully admit that this is a bit more speculative because it's a little more subtle. In the American Jewish scene, the heir of Kahane is Mort Klein, who runs the ZOA. Now, why do I say that? First of all, I have to make the distinction. In what he says, Mort Klein sees himself. He presents himself as the great champion of Jabotinsky and Begin. But in his rhetoric about the state, about Israeli politics, about Palestinians, in his rhetoric about the relationship between Jews and other groups in the United States, he's a lot more like Kahane. Now, it's difficult to present yourself as an heir of Kahane because nobody likes Kahane, and Jabotinsky and Begin are icons. It's much easier to do that. But his understanding of who has a right to the state of Israel, there's not a lot of room for Palestinians in Morton Klein's understanding of the state of Israel. One of the reasons why he so easily supports the recent talk about annexation is, in his mind, annexation isn't violating anyone's rights because they weren't supposed to be there in the first place. And remember, we saw earlier tonight, that's not what Jabotinsky said. It's also not what Begin said. It's what Kahane said. Now, the most recent controversial thing he tweeted was about the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a very complicated thing. But in his tweet about Black Lives Matter, and you can go look at it online, there is an element of essentializing the African Americans in the same way that Smotrich essentializes Palestinians. There is, I would say, a hint of racism in Mort Klein's rhetoric. Now, no one is more surprised by this than me, especially as the leader of the ZOA. If you really want to measure Kahane's impact on American Jewry, is the ZOA for a very long time, until the 90s, I think, was not the ZOA of today. I mean, it was founded by Louis Brandeis. It was a very different organization. And I would say until the 1990s, the ZOA's outlook in terms of how American Jews should see Israel was a pretty workable combination between Herzl and Ben-Gurion and Begin or Jabotinsky. It worked. But since the 1990s, ZOA has gravitated in a more Kahane-esque direction. Now, I can't say that I can put my finger on them quoting and praising Kahane. It's hard to find. They don't really do that. Like Smotrich, they're seeing themselves as the heir of Jabotinsky and the heir of Begin. But if we could bring Jabotinsky and Begin back, they wouldn't recognize what ZOA has become, and they certainly wouldn't recognize what Smotrich was trying to do as their own ideas, And so we get a sense of why Kahane was at once so beloved, but also vilified. Vilified is easy. Most Jews, and I would say most American Jews, and even most Israelis who have served in the army, while recognizing that active armed defense is necessary from time to time, the insistence on violence and especially vengeance that was such a core element of Kahane's outlook on the world, most Jews simply don't disagree with that. Where Kahane still resonates today, it really reflects something broader, I think. The writings of Kahane, like Kahane when he was still alive, what he was very good at doing was eliciting fear and outrage. And let's face it, in 2020, fear and outrage are very prevalent commodities right now. The fastest way to reach a group of people is through fear and outrage. Today more than ever, it is easier to lament the problem than to look for the solution. That fear, outrage, and despair are much easier than any kind of cautious optimism or hope. Those are more difficult propositions. But Kahane still has his following. Now, at this point, I would say Kahane's following is still marginal, but it's moved in the direction of the mainstream. I think it's worth thinking, and it would be, it would be great to have someone like Begin here reflect on what if American Jewry or the state of Israel really became the vision of Kahane. Begin would not have liked it. Shamir didn't like it. Most Jews, most Israelis don't like it. For us, it's a cautionary note you can't dismiss Kahane. You have to understand him, but you also have to understand why he resonates so deeply with those who are devoted to him, and why he elicits such strident criticism from those who are critical of him. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Howie. We have a few questions and comments in the chat. Before we get to them, I wanted to ask you something about this quote from Kahane from the late 60s, early 70s. Kahane was assassinated in 1990, I think it was.
Yes.
So he's been dead for 30 years.
Yes.
I was surprised by the quote you mentioned where he said that, the Jewish, we shouldn't be worrying about Black people. We should be worrying about anti-Semitism from white people, because I know he also would march against neo-Nazis and stuff. I'm curious, and you might need a crystal ball to answer this. What do you think he would have said in today's climate of groups like the Black Hebrew Israelites or the Nation of Islam or African-American groups that are very openly anti-Semitic? Do you think he would have still dismissed that, or do you think he would have called it out?
Well, he never dismissed anything. Kahane, for all his theology and for all his powerful idealism, he was a realist. He was very effective at recognizing a problem. So there's no question he would see, I think Farrakhan is the one he would see as the real threat. The Black Hebrews and the rest of that and those isolated tweets, I don't think he would pay much heed to that, but he would see anti-Semitism in the African-American community as a problem. Having said that, he would not see that as big a problem as the standard right-wing, white supremacy, neo-Nazi, Ku Klux Klan anti-Semitism. If nothing else, for Kahane, the greatest threat to Jews was Nazism and later manifestations of Nazism. And in that sense, there is no way he would have bought into the rhetoric of Antifa, for example, being in any way the same kind of threat as white nationalists. He would have seen neo-Nazis, white nationalists, KKK as reminiscent of the stories he heard from his survivor family members about Nazi Germany. Now, but you have to remember both. I want you to, the takeaway is both things. You would definitely have seen anti-Semitism from the African-American community as a problem. He would definitely have seen anti-Semitism of the left as a problem, the BDS movement as a problem, but he would not have seen either of those problems as serious as the white nationalism problem.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Let's see. Let me see. Let's look at some questions here.
You want to say something?
Yeah.
Put it in the chat, on chat.
Well, we've got a lot of interesting statements. Oh, there's someone who asked a question about Baruch Goldstein. Baruch Goldstein in Israel. Baruch Goldstein is an example of, he wasn't directly impacted by Kahane, but he is someone who reflects a similar mentality. Yigal Amir, the one who assassinated Rabin, the same thing. Kahane died in 1990, and he had been out of Israel for a few years, but his point of view resonated in certain pockets in Israeli society. What's interesting about Baruch Goldstein and the fellow who assassinated Rabin is they both did so not only for political reasons, but they both felt theologically justified. And that theological justification of a political act of violence, that's Kahanism. That's Kahane in a nutshell. I believe that the taking of this life is not only acceptable, but necessary. I am performing the will of God. Now, does that mean that Kahane would have approved of that? He was dead. It's impossible to know. But maybe. He would have had to recognize at the very least that those individuals were acting in the mentality that he had helped create. Okay. How widespread are Kahane and his movement among American Jews? Like I said, Kahanism, the JDL is still a very small organization. I would say open, overt embrace of Kahane is still a relatively marginal phenomenon, but you find in every community, I would say in every congregation, there are Kahanics, they're around. I would say, but I would say that indirectly his ideas have had a greater impact. And by indirectly, I mean individuals who embrace the ideas without realizing that they're embracing the ideas of Meir Kahane. Okay. Here, they're mostly comments. I didn't know that the JDL used to have a big billboard at LaGuardia Airport. I think that's a little funny, but that's LaGuardia. It's always been a really screwed up place. Although now they've redone it. Okay. Here's an interesting comment. Kahane was one of the first to mention the problem of demography in Israel, of the fact that the Arabs in Israel, the Palestinians have a faster growth rate. That is correct. That's what I mean. He was an excellent diagnostician of the problem. The problem is, the solution to that problem is, which he correctly diagnosed, is to kick everybody out. In the same way, he was the first to speak out in strident terms against the assimilation of American Jews, but his solution was basically to dismiss assimilated American Jews, just simply to condemn them. In his mind, there was a club, and you were in the club if you shared his political views, you shared his views of Arabs, and you were religious. If you were a non-Orthodox person in Kahane's worldview, you were simply not important. You were marginalized, and your children were going to disappear anyway, so no one has to care about you. He didn't see a future for the non-Orthodox mentality. I would love to walk him through the halls of Hillel Day School, show him that. But he would have trouble with the concept of a non-Orthodox day school actually managing to perpetuate some sort of sustained Jewish identity. Okay. When did he move to Israel? He moved to Israel in 1971, 3 years after founding the JDL. Are there still politicians in Israel that speak of population transfer? Only on the far right, Smotrich and his little group, but not as aggressively as Meir Kahane did. Okay. I think that's pretty much the sum total of it. Okay. I think. Oh, here's an interesting question. Was his assassination the first act of Al-Qaeda terror in the United States? That's a good question. I've never heard that before. He was assassinated in 1990 by an Egyptian emigre who was living in the United States, who was disgruntled about many, many things. I don't think this individual was associated with Al-Qaeda. Where the question gets interesting, what Kahane's assassin shared with Al-Qaeda was Al-Qaeda doesn't only have a problem with Israel. Al-Qaeda is more than anything else an anti-Western organization. And this Egyptian who killed Meir Kahane wasn't only killing a Jew, he was also killing a Jewish radical who didn't like his politics, but he was killing an American Jew. This was an anti-Western act. And in that sense, I wouldn't connect him to Al-Qaeda so specifically, but yes, it is part of the surging anti-Western mentality in the Muslim world. Okay. If there are no other questions, I think this is a good place to pause. So I thank you. Norm, you want to ask a question? You waving goodbye? I think he's waving goodbye. Okay. All right. Good. We will conclude our series next week. Next week, we're going to talk about Zalman Schachter Shalomi, the founder of the spiritual renewal movement. And, I wasn't going to end the series on a Kahane note. Zalman Schachter Shalomi is a very nice note to end the series. That will continue with next Tuesday. Thank you. Be healthy, be safe.
Thanks, Howie.
Thank you so much, Howie. And we'll see you next week.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Howie.
Good night.